Hi, I'm Aaron McCullough, the curator of exhibits at the Springs Preserve, and we're continuing our walk through the Desert Living Center, talking about some of the sustainable architecture and design choices that were made building this part of the facility. One of them has to do with what I'm standing on. First and foremost, we've got carpet squares. Now these squares are made from recycled soda bottles or water bottles, and that is a great thing, of course, so they're not ending up in our landfill. These days, a lot of folks are moving back towards carpet squares, and it makes total sense because if you ever stain a square or get a rip, we have a small supply in back. We can swap them out, put in a new one, and we don't have to replace the entire carpet. Underneath that, in fact, is something else, and that's what we call our radiant floor heating. And an example, or a kind of a peek through window of that is right here. And there are water pipes that are actually running through the, under the floorboards. And there's a solar hot water heater on top of the building. It warms water, and then these pipes move that warm water through here during the winter time. And that ends up helping to heat the building. We are not beings that are 20 feet tall that live up near the ceiling. So it makes sense to have your heat source or your cool source as much as possible coming from the floor, because we as humans are hanging out, standing on the floor. And so that way, again, we're reducing the energy loads in this particular building by not having to cool or heat the area where people are not. And the other thing that we have has to do with these overhangs inside and outside the building. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about these. These overhangs are built in such a way that they take advantage of the angle or declination of the sun. So depending on the time of the year, during the winter time, the sun tends to be a little bit lower on the horizon. And so that's why we have these pretty tall windows. We want to have as much light coming in. During the summertime, however, it sits higher on the horizon, and that's when it's super hot, and maybe we don't want to have as much sunlight coming in. So we have overhangs outside of the building, which go out maybe about 2 to 3 feet, and they prevent, as the sun angles high, so too much light from coming into the building to overheat it. So here we are in the banquet room of the Desert Living Center at the Springs Preserve, and there are a number of sustainable architecture points I want to mention, as well as some interior design choices. First and foremost, these large beams, that's what we commonly refer to as glulam. Now that is scrap wood that was salvaged from being put in a landfill. It is then immersed in a low toxic glue to the point where the glue completely permeates through the wood, and the wood can then be taken out and then bent, like you see here, into custom shapes. And then when it dries as one large, strong block. So here they're, again, salvaging wood so it doesn't end up in the landfill. Another thing I want to point out is the floor here. The floor here, they try to use as many naturally occurring geologic forms. So we've got a lot of rocks and stones that are set into the floor, which is great. Also the paints. The paints are a low, what we call a VOC paint, volatile organic compound. Those are the things that come off the paints that oftentimes can make people sick. Now, another thing I want to point out has to do with the insulation. We use something a little bit different here, and I want to show it to you over here. And we call these our verdad windows, and that's the word in Spanish for truth. So the truth behind the wall here is that we have straw bale insulation. And this is a byproduct from the rice straw industry up near the Sacramento area. And it would have just been burned or thrown in the landfill. So in this particular case, it was salvaged and turned into insulation for our buildings here. And it's very, very densely packed. So think of a very densely packed hay bale, even more densely packed than I think most traditional hay bales. And one question I often get from folks is, well, isn't that possibly a fire danger? All fires require oxygen to kind of fuel that fire. Because this is so densely packed, even though the outer edge of it might burn, there's no ability for the oxygen to kind of fuel that fire and to make it larger. Maybe the edge might burn, that's about it. So it turned out to be a really good thing for us. Now, practically speaking, as a replacement for that pink or yellow commercial insulation, that stuff is looked at by they looked at something called an R factor. The R factor tells us how good of an insulator it is. Usually that stuff is around 18, 19, 20. This is around an R56, much higher level of insulation, much better at keeping the cold inside the building during the summer or the heat inside during the winter, and vice versa. So it's a really good replacement for us for the less sustainable material. And it's one of the many types of things that we're trying to showcase here at the Desert Living Center.